first book of Chronicles, chapter 5. 2 weeks ago, we did the first 4 chapters, and we continue in chapter 5 today. It's a book that has been written by the scribe Ezra after the return from exile. Scribes or what they would do is they would write legal documents, marriage contracts, loans, inheritance, mortgages, legal documents like that is what scribes would write up, but they also translated scriptures. And during the Babylonian captivity or the Assyrian captivity, the Jews did not have a temple. And what they did is they began to meet in small groups. And the scribes would then take the initiative, and the scribes would teach them. They would be the most educated from the law, since they were the ones that translated Scripture. And so they would teach these small groups. And their reasoning was that this must never happen again, for us to be taken captive and taken in exile because of our sins. We must instruct our people. And that's why they did that. After they came back from captivity, back into the land, they continued to meet in these small groups, even though the temple was rebuilt somewhat, not completely initially. Later on, it was completely restored, but they continued meeting in these small groups, and the scribes would continue to teach them. And there was this specific group of scribes that separated themselves and began to teach. They were, in Hebrew, they were called the Parushis. And later on, they were called the Pharisees. And that is why when we come to the New Testament, we have Pharisees. They came from the time of the exile. That's where the Pharisees began. And these meetings that they had, where they met to study, were called, later on, they were called synagogues. And that's also what we see in the New Testament. We see Pharisees and we see synagogues. Both of that originated during the time that they were in captivity. And Ezra was one of them who brought a group back from captivity back into the land of Israel. The first 9 chapters are names. It's basically a genealogy proving that David comes, or that the Messiah comes from the line of David. And it's important. Ezra was probably in charge of trying to figure out who came from where, because when he came back, they needed Levites, priests, to serve in the temple. And they needed to know where they came from. So they had to study it up and see where the genealogy was, and that's why it's recorded here in the Bible. They also needed to know where the people were to live, because they were given land according to their tribes or their genealogy. So they had to know where they came from so they could place them in the right land. And ultimately, it was important because we needed to know they needed to know where the Messiah came from, that he came from the lineage of David, because that is what God had promised to Abraham. Last study, we picked out some names that were more notable than others, and we kind of went through the chapters like that. We'll continue to do that in the remaining 4 chapters of names. So beginning in chapter 5 and verse 1, it says, "Now the sons of Reuben, the firstborn of Israel, he was indeed the firstborn, but because he defiled his father's bed, his birthright was given to the sons of Joseph, the sons of Israel, so that the genealogy is not listed according to the birthright. Yet Judah prevailed over his brothers, and from him came a ruler, although the birthright was Joseph's." Reuben was the oldest of Jacob's sons, and the birthright should have legally gone to him, but Reuben defiled his father's bed. He had relations with Jacob's concubine, and because of that, this right was stripped from him and given rather to Joseph, 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim. If you look in verse 6, it says, "And Bera, his son, whom Tiglath-Pileser, king of Syria, carried into captivity, he was leader of the Reubenites. When Israel sinned, Tiglath-Pileser carried the northern tribes captive to Assyria. Now, Tiglath-Pileser is the king of the Assyrians. In 722 BC, he came to the northern part of Israel, and he took them captive and took them into Assyria. 135 years later, the Babylonians came and took the southern kingdom captive. Sometimes when we read the Bible and we read of the northern kingdom taken captive and the southern, we kind of look like, okay, it's a couple years in between. No, it was 135 years before that the northern tribe was taken captive, before the southern tribe. And something happened during that period of time, and that is that the Assyrian kings, there was some political issues in that the kings of the Assyrians begin to crumble a little bit. There was one king, normally in those days, kings were really involved in military activity. They would go and fight every summer and expand their territory. But there was this certain king that he didn't like to go out fighting. He loved to read. That's all he did. He just read. He accumulated books. He actually bragged about accumulating stones that had been discovered from before the flood. And he prided himself in being able to read the writings from before the flood and all that. And so he just sent some of his generals out to fight. Kind of, the military didn't fight the same without the king there. And then he had a son, but he died before the son was old. It was basically still a minor, and then the eunuch became king until he was old enough, but then the child disappeared, and then later the eunuch disappeared, and then eventually the military was disgruntled, and revolts started breaking out, and there was turmoil within the Assyrians. And the Babylonians, they took advantage of that. And they came in and they plundered the Assyrians. They were able to conquer the Assyrians. So in these 135 years, there was a shift in world power from the Assyrians to the Babylonians. And so when the Babylonians now come and take the southern tribe captive, now there's a mixture of people, because the Assyrians are now assimilated with the Babylonians, and now the northern and southern tribes are all mixed up. And so when they finally come back, Ezra and Nehemiah, and they bring the people back into the land, it's just, they're all intermarried, and it's all mixed up, and pagan wives, and Ezra weeps because of that. So as a result of that, it was difficult, and genealogy was important to be able to, and some of them, even at that time, they couldn't figure out who they came from. So they just couldn't serve as priests, especially if you were of the tribe of Levi. If they couldn't figure out that you really did come from that tribe, you could not serve as a priest. And so because of that, there was quite a bit of mixture going on in terms of people relations. So begin and then continue verse 23. It says, "So the children of the half tribe of Manasseh dwelt in the land. Their numbers increased from Besran to Baal Hermon, that is to Senir or Mount Hermon." So that's the north of Israel. "These were the heads of their father's house: Epher, Ishai, Eliel, Azriel, Jeremiah, Hodaviah, and Japhiel. They were mighty men of valor, famous men, and heads of their father's houses. And they were unfaithful to the God of their fathers, and played the harlot after the gods of the peoples of the land, whom God had destroyed before them. So the God of Israel stirred up the spirit of Pul, king of Assyria, that is Tiglath-Pileser, the king of Syria. He carried the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh into captivity. He took them to Helah, Hebor, Hera, and the river of Goshan to this day." When Moses, he brought the people out of Egypt. He brought them to the Jordan River. And then he died, and Joshua took them into the land. Crossed the Jordan River, took them into the land. But 2.5 tribes did not cross the Jordan River. Well, they crossed initially to help fight the Canaanites, but then they returned and they stayed on the eastern side of the Jordan River. The Reubenites, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. Those two and a half tribes stayed on the eastern side of the Jordan. Now Moses was not happy because God did not tell them to inherit the land east of the Jordan. But they settled there. They settled for second best. And I think to this day that's still the same way. Many people settle for second best. They never really tap into the fullness of God. They kind of live on the fringes, if you would, a little bit on the outside. They try to see how much they can get away with. How much sin can I get away? How far can I be from the center of God's will and still receive blessings from God? People do that. And that is what these 2.5 tribes did. In a sense, we could say they did not completely yield to the Spirit. They kind of lived a fleshly life, if you would. Not really tapping into the life of abundance. Well, what happened? They were the first ones that were picked off. When the king of Assyria came, he first took these 2.5 tribes and took them captive, before he came back and took the others. So we see that those who live on the fringe, those who live on the outside, those who are not really plugged in, those are the first ones that are being picked off by the enemy. And then in chapter 6, this chapter describes the descendants of Levi and Aaron. The entire tribe of Levi had a special place in Israel, be given to the service of God in the temple. If you look in verse 1, the sons of Levi were Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. The sons of Kohath were Amram, Issachar, Hebron, and Uzziel. Now these are people that you will see if you read of the Exodus, you read during the 40 years in the desert, you will see the names of Gershon, Kohath, and Merari frequently, because that's where the priests and Levites came from. And down in verse 31, it says, "Now these are the men whom David appointed over the service of the song in the house of the Lord after the ark came to rest. They were ministering with music before the dwelling place of the tabernacle of meeting until Solomon had built the house of the Lord in Jerusalem. And they served in the office according to their order." David was the one that orchestrated a lot of the music that happened in the tabernacle and later in the temple. Music would be going 24/7. And he put people in. They were paid to do this, and they would worship. And he was an inventor of not just music. David was not just a skilled musician, but he was also an inventor of musical instruments. And it says here that they served according to their order. So we see that music was organized. It was necessary to keep a good, vibrant music team going. They had to serve according to their giftings, according to their abilities. Some had talent in singing, others probably talent in music, and in different ways. But there was order in the way that it was done. And I think this can be overdone, where we become overly structured and organized. But it can be done the opposite way, where it's just chaos in the church. Now, in this church, the Bible says, let everything be done decently and in order. So we try to strike a balance when it comes to the way we do church. Now, we don't have an issue really here much with speaking in tongues. I know that there are people in this church that have the ability. God has gifted them. They speak in tongues. But we don't practice speaking in tongues here at church. If someone would speak in tongues during worship, we would ask for interpretation. If there's no interpretation, you couldn't continue speaking in tongues. The Bible says that. But it's not, here is not something that we try to maintain order. And things like that, we would encourage that to be practiced more in smaller groups. But also, simple things like worship. Sometimes certain people stand up during worship and others are all sitting. It's not a sin to stand up. But there's one thing that you should think about. When you stand up and everybody else is sitting, and there's one or two standing, are you a distraction to those who are around you? Or you're standing somewhere out of the order or out of line, are you now becoming a distraction for the entire church? And it can be selfish. So we need to be aware of those things. We worship. We're all worshiping together, and not worship in such a way as to be a distraction to someone that is next to us. So worship in order. It can be overdone where we are too strict, but it can be done in a way that it is too lax and it becomes disorderly. Now, if you look down in verse 33, and these are the sons who ministered with their sons. Of the sons of the Kohathites were Heman the singer, the son of Joel, the son of Samuel. Heman, if you notice that name there, Heman was an important figure during the time of the Ark of the Covenant when it was brought back during the time of David. If you remember the story, it was taken captive by the Philistines, and later it was brought back again by David. Uzziah died as a result because they didn't carry the ark the way it was supposed to be carried on the shoulders of priests. They carried it on a cart. Uzziah tried to balance it and to keep it from falling off the cart, and he was struck. But Heman was an important figure already there during that time, organizing all the singing and all the worship. And we see that he's mentioned numerous times during the time of David. For example, in 1 Chronicles 15:17, it says, so the Levites appointed Heman, the son of Joel, and his brethren. Or 1 Chronicles 16:41, and with them Heman and Jeduthun and the rest were chosen. 1 Chronicles 25:1, moreover, David and the captains of his army separated for service some of the sons of Asaph and Heman. So we see a number of times Heman was really gifted when it came to leading the people in worship. And when we think about someone like Heman, so he's really gifted. He's probably a great vocals. He's really gifted with music. And we might think that, man, a guy like that must have had a great life, an easy life, right? Just being paid and every day coming to the temple and worshiping. Must have been awesome. Well, not exactly. We know that he was a man that knew affliction. He was acquainted with trouble in his life. We read of that in Psalms 88. Psalms 88 is a psalm that is written by Heman and dedicated to Heman. Let me read that psalm. If you want to turn there, you can turn to Psalm 88. Psalm 88 says, a psalm of the sons of Korah, a contemplation of Heman, the Ezrahite. And this is what he says, O Lord, God of my salvation, I have cried out day and night before you. Let my prayer come before you. Incline your ear to my cry, for my soul is full of troubles, and my life draws near to the grave. I am counted with those who go down to the pit. I am like a man who has no strength, adrift from the dead, like the slain who lie in the grave, whom you remember no more, and who are cut off from your hand. You have laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the depths. Your wrath lies heavy upon me, and you have afflicted me with all your waves. It's as if he's going through grief or going through some form of affliction which covers him in the form of waves. Now, maybe the Lord allowed him to go through extra trouble, extra difficulties in his life, in order for him to grow in depth in worship. I don't know, but he didn't have an easy life. And but I think that we don't like trouble, we don't like affliction, we like to have it easy. But the bottom line is that our life is like a tree. When a tree grows in the midst of lots of storms, it shoots down, it roots deeper. It just does. And it's the same in our life. When we go through storms, we don't like them, but they're needed and necessary in our life because they cause us to grow deeper. In verse 54 of chapter 6, it says, Now these are their dwellings places throughout their settlements in the territory, for they were given by lot to the sons of Aaron of the family of the Kohathites. So the Levites were given, they didn't get their own piece of land. I think we mentioned that in our last study. There were 48 plots of land that were given to the priests. They were not living in the city walls. If you had a town and they were living outside of it, kind of by themselves. They were given enough land to have gardens and graze their cattle. And then in chapter 7, and this chapter gives us the genealogy of the sons of Issachar. Verse 10, the son of Jediel was Bilhan, and the sons of Bilhan were Jeush, Benjamin, Ehud. Now Ehud is one of the individuals that we read of in Judges chapter 3 in verse 15. I'll read to you. This is what it says about Ehud. That he was one of the judges. And it says, but when the children of Israel cried out to the Lord raised up a deliverer for them, Ehud, the son of Gera, the Benjamite, a left-handed man. By him the children of Israel sent tribute to Eglon, king of Moab. Now Ehud made himself a dagger. It was a double-edged and cubit in length, and fastened it under his clothes on his right thigh. Then Ehud reached with his left hand, took the dagger from his right thigh, and thrust it into his belly. Even the hilt went after the blade, and the fat closed over the blade, for he did not draw the dagger out of his belly, and his entrails came out. So this is Ehud, who went and killed one of the kings of the Moabites that came in and plundered the Israelites during the time of the judges. If you look at the nation of Israel, so it was Moses who brought them out of Egypt, and then we have Joshua who brought them into the promised land across the Jordan. After Judges, we have Othniel. He was the next one in line. And then we have Ehud and Shamgar and Deborah and Gideon, and the list goes on. There were 12 judges during that period of time. After the 12 judges, there was a deterioration that happened in the land, in that the judges were somewhat corrupt, but also the priests became corrupt, because Eli was the high priest. He was lax with his sons, and they were evil, and then we had Samuel, who was a good priest. But the people during that time, they were like, we've had enough of this. These judges are corrupt. Eli is corrupt. His sons are corrupt. They're lying with the women at the tabernacle, and it was, and so they said, we want a king. And that is where the kings start coming in, and Saul is the first king. So we had 12 judges. We have Moses, Joshua, and then 12 judges, and then the kings start with King Saul. It's interesting how quickly the nation of Israel began to slide. I find it amazing. It's Moses and Joshua, and then Othniel. They're full swing into just intermarrying with the pagans and beginning to worship their gods so quickly. I think it can happen today in the sense that, for them it was intermarrying with the Canaanites that were to be destroyed. The people became complacent, and I think today the church can do the same thing. Rather than pushing back darkness and evil, the church can become complacent and begins to intermarry with the world, allowing the practices of the world to infiltrate the church. Rather than the church infiltrating the world, it's the opposite. And it happened here, and I think it can happen today. We must be careful that that doesn't take place. In chapter 8, the tribe of Benjamin is already mentioned in the last chapter. We didn't really cover that, but he was mentioned there. The Benjamites in chapter 8 speaks of them again. There's more attention given to the tribe of the Benjamites than the other tribes. And maybe because the tribe of Benjamin their land was Jerusalem. the city of Jerusalem, the Benjamites settled in and around Jerusalem. We have Ephraim, Joseph's son, was to the north of Jerusalem, and Judah to the south, and Benjamin was in the middle. If you look in verse 40, chapter 8. Now the sons of Ulam were mighty men of valor, archers. They had many sons and grandsons, 150 all, and these were all sons of Benjamin. So the Benjamites were known because they were great warriors. They were good with slings. They were good with bow and arrows. We actually see in the Old Testament that they were so good they were able to just, hit a little mark just, hundreds of feet away. They were just so good with their slings, and they were placed right in the temple, around the temple, to protect the temple. In chapter 9, and this is a summary of the genealogies. If you look in verse 1, so all the Israel was recorded by genealogies, and indeed they were inscribed in the book of the kings of Israel. But Judah was carried away captive to Babylon because of their unfaithfulness. And the first inhabitants who dwelt in their possessions and their cities were Israelites, priests, Levites, and the Nethinim. Not because kingdoms clashed and they happened to be conquered. That was not why Israel was conquered. No, it was because God removed his protection because of their wickedness. Could have been avoided if they had followed the Lord with their full heart. And I think that's why God hates sin, because sin brings pain. Sin brings annihilation. And the enemy comes in and causes havoc, and we see that. We see at the pinnacle of David and Solomon how well the nation, how well off it was, and how the people prospered. And then they begin to slide, and God removed the protection, and we see how the enemies came and plundered the temple, plundered the people. It was sad to see that. And it happens in our life as well. When we walk away from the Lord and we begin to follow the things of this world, the same thing happens, where God removes his protection and our lives are plundered. And we lose our peace. We lose our love for one another. And the enemy begins to have a stronghold in our life. So we have here the priests, the Levites, and the Nethinim. Now, we all know who priests are and Levites, but who are the Nethinim? Well, the Nethinim were those who assisted the Levites. They helped with the wood cutting, carrying water, sweeping the tabernacle, or later the temple. Kind of like deacons today. They were there to help. I guess like deacons help pastors and elders, so it was the Nethinims helped the Levites. Now down in verse 28, let me see. Down in verse 28, it says, now some of them were in charge of serving the vessels, for they brought them in and took them out by count. Some of them were appointed over the furnishings and over all the implements of the sanctuary, and over the fine flour and the wine and the oil and incense and spices. So we see the responsibilities of the Levites. They were in charge of the vessels that were in the temple, preparing incense, preparing the ointments. This was something that was discontinued after 70 A.D. when the temple was destroyed. No longer did these practices of the Levites and the sacrifices continue. So these oils that were prepared, this incense that was used in the temple, had to be prepared in a very particular way. We read of that in the book of Leviticus. But for 2,000 years it didn't happen until 1948, when the Jews came back into the land of Israel. They began to study. For several years they spent studying how was the menorah built, for example? How was these incenses? How were they? How were they made? And so the Israelites, or the Jews, began to prepare for another temple. I find that interesting because the Bible does prophesy in Daniel chapter 9, Matthew 24 and 25, in the book of Revelation. We see that another temple is coming. Another temple will be built, and the Jews are preparing for another temple. When I was in Israel, one of the highlights, one of the things that I really wanted to see was the Temple Institute. That was something that I knew that was something that I wanted to see, and I had the opportunity to walk through the Temple Institute, and they have pretty much all of the vessels and the utensils that will be needed in the temple are right there inside the Temple Institute. You can see them. It's interesting to see that the shovels, for example, that they'll be using to shovel the coal and the ashes from the altar, all of that is handcrafted. It's made from copper. You can see that they hammered it and made it exactly the way Moses would have made it back in the Old Testament. They studied Bezalel, who was the craftsman during the time in the Sinai. He was the one who crafted most of it. And they studied who Bezalel was, and they saw that he was a man that came from Egypt, and he would have learned under the Egyptians. So they went back and looked at how did Egyptian make it, and how would he have done that in the desert. And they actually went into the desert, to the Sinai desert, and they cut out of the rock at the same location where Bezalel would have made the menorah, for example, and they took a rock and they made a mold from the rock, poured it full of bronze, and then they covered it with gold. And the menorah today stands inside the Temple Institute. You can see it there. It weighs 1,000 pounds. 1,000 pounds, has 100 pounds of 4-carat gold. And it's ready. It's there, ready to be lit. The altar stands there. It's made in 2 pieces or several pieces so that it can easily be removed and taken to the temple. These utensils that are there, they're all dedicated. They have already been dedicated. They're ready to go. We don't have to wait for anything. The Ark of the Covenant is there in gold. You can see it, but it's kind of like as a spare, because they believe they know where the original one is, but they're not allowed to dig because the Arabs control that particular location. But they think they will find it. But if they don't, then they have this one ready to go. And then there's the menorah, so you see that. And the clothes for the priests, they are there. They have manicures standing there, and the priests already have the actual clothes on that they'll be used in the third temple. But then beside the menorah, it stands there, and they have these vessels of oil. And these are the vessels of oil that will be used in the third temple. And this was the first oil that was produced, again, in a pure way, according to Levitical instructions, after 2,000 years. So it is there for you to see. You can go there, you can see it. It's the first oil that was prepared, again, exactly the way God instructed them in the book of Leviticus. In fact, God said, if anyone produces this type of oil just for himself, should be cut off from the people. This was a special oil, a special way it was to be produced only by the priests. And so today it's ready to go. They're just waiting for them to get the green light to build the temple, and then all the vessels and the oils and the menorah and the Ark of the Covenant, the clothes and the laver, and all of that is ready to go, just waiting for the temple to be rebuilt. In chapter 10, here we have an abbreviated story of Saul. Chronicles is not about the story of Saul, but of David. Now, we know that Saul was a failure by his own admission. He said, I have played the fool. He came from a good family. He came from the Benjamite family. He came from the warriors. He came from a good family. He was tall. He was strong. He was good looking. He had good men around him. We know that he had a good relationship with his father. He came from a good, healthy family, it would seem. If anyone should have been successful, if that's the word we want to use, it should have been Saul. But he wasn't. And the reason is because he became prideful. He became selfish. He became stubborn. And God could not use him. His life revolved around himself and trying to extinguish the man that God had raised up to be his successor. That's what his life pretty much consisted of, trying to extinguish the life of David rather than going and fighting the enemies of Israel. We'll come back next week and we will continue the study in chapter 10. But the question I think we should ask ourselves is, we see these men here in Chronicles. We pointed out just a couple of them in our studies. Jeconiah, Jabez, Ehud, Heman. They were men that left a legacy. They were men that even thousands of years later we read of their lives. How will our life be remembered after we have passed off the scenes? Are we someone that is making a difference? And I don't think, we all have to make a